Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. I'm Emeritus Professor Glenn McConnell from Victoria University in Australia. The idea behind Inside Exercise is to bring to you the absolute who's who of exercise research. So exercise physiology, exercise metabolism, and exercise and health. And what I'm really wanting is for you to get your exercise information from the research experts rather than from influencers. And indeed, today I bring to you Professor Irene Davis from the University of South Florida. She's a very accomplished researcher and indeed is actually currently the president of the American College of Sports Medicine, which is a prestigious role. This is the biggest sports medicine society in the world. And she is perfect for this because she's a researcher, she's a physical therapist, which we call a physiotherapist in Australia. So she brings together both science and the practical aspects. Her main focus is that we were actually born to run, and we, over millions and millions of years, we were running with minimalist or no shoes and landing on our forefoot, so the front of the foot rather than on the heel. So she makes the case that running shoes tend to make you land on your heel rather than the forefoot, and this can result in more running injuries. So she's a big fan of minimalist shoes. She's also a fan of keeping things simple, so not trying to prevent over pronation, over supination, etc. So using neutral shoes with minimal heels. She's also a fan of potentially changing your gait if you're having problems. So if you're not having problems, don't change the gait. So she has evidence that if you change the way you run, it may reduce your injuries if indeed you're having problems initially. So again, not changing it if you're not injured. I think she makes convincing cases for these, but I know we've got some upcoming speakers who may think this is somewhat controversial, so you can look forward to that as well. I found it really interesting. I think you will too, so stick around. Now, if you'd like to do me a favor and also spread the word about Inside Exercise, please like, comment, subscribe, etc., because that'll help when people are doing a search for various topics. It'll be more likely that the algorithm will suggest Inside Exercise. Also, as usual, it's much better if you listen to the whole podcast to get the full context. But if you'd like to skip around a little bit, you'll see down in the notes, there are timestamps. So if you're on YouTube, you can click on the time and it'll take you to that point. And on the other platforms, you can just look at the time and then move to that point. Okay, so enjoy the chat. Hi, Irene. How are you? Welcome to Inside Exercise.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Great. All right. So that's we're going to talk about a lot of things, right? And it could actually end up being quite a long one because I'm an injured runner, so I'm all bitter and twisted. And you're the current president of the American College of Sports Medicine, which is very impressive. So we'll talk about that later. But we are here indeed to talk about running injuries, all things to do with running injuries. But what I often like to start off with is just how did you get into exercise? Were you a sports person? Like a lot of us were like sports people and then go, oh, we could do this as a job. Or were you a scientist first and then started doing running injuries and
I
things?
think maybe a little bit. Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both. So I played field hockey in high school. I cheerleaded. I was pretty active all through high school. And even in college, I ran and was pretty active. But I think really I got interested in the human body. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I always tell the story when people ask me what I was going to do because I wanted to be an FBI agent. And I wrote J. Edgar Hoover and asked him if I could be. I used to dream about getting caught and being like Agent 99 with her magic lipstick, all of that. And so I love that stuff. I still now to this day love investigator ID and love solving crimes and those kinds of things. I just think it's a lot of fun. So I think I always had that sort of scientific sort of approach to things and sort of problem solving. I've always liked to do that. But I was very interested in the human body and did a degree in exercise science, decided that I really wanted to get a health aspect of it, sort of merged that with medicine. And that's really what got me into physical therapy. And I did physical therapy for a while, but I really got fascinated with how we move and sort of abnormal movements and how they relate to injury. And that's how I got into biomechanics. And so I have spent my career with one foot in biomechanics, one foot in science, and one foot in the clinical world. And it's been a great space for me because the clinical experiences that I have help to generate questions, and then I can answer those questions in the research lab, and then I can bring it right back into the clinic and apply it. And I've done that. And I think it's just closing the loop, and it's really been fun. So, yeah. So that's kind of how I got to where I am today in terms of my career.
That's interesting. That's very interesting in several ways. So physical therapy for the Australians, we call it physiotherapy. So that's
Yeah.
interesting. And actually, before we came on air, I said physiotherapy isn't very evidence-based. You said, well, because it's interesting. My first PhD student, Scott Bradley, was a physical therapist, physiotherapist, and then he came and did a PhD in exercise. And he always said how it wasn't evidence-based, but that was
Many years ago, probably.
1995 or something. So
I
it's
think
much
back
more
then we
evidence-based.
were just starting, but I think it's really come a long way. And
Yeah.
I know most of the clinicians that I know are either look to evidence to sort of base their treatment, and those who are in science are really trying to develop that evidence.
Yeah, great. So it's much more fun talking about, a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about today. It's much more fun and important if there's evidence for it rather than there's, oh, we don't really know, we don't really know. The other thing that's interesting is I really like these crime shows. I actually like the real, rather than the pretend ones. I like
Me
when it's
too.
a
I like
real
the real one.
crime.
Yep, me
Exactly.
too.
And my wife's always like, oh, it's just morbid. And it's like, I just realized thanks to you, it's actually research. It is research. It's
Yeah, problem
trying to
solving.
problem
I
solving.
love the problem solving. Yeah, yeah. I think that's why.
There you go. So I'm not just being morbid. All right,
No,
great. Thanks for that. Now we're going to talk a lot about shoes and, does wearing shoes improve things, reduce injuries, increase injuries, and biomechanics of the foot and all this sort of stuff. But, we'll get to that later. What I want to do initially is just, it's about running injuries, and obviously shoes can play a role in that. But the first thing people think about is, how do I reduce injuries? Should I stretch? Should I strengthen? Should I run on grass? Should I run on the road? Should I whatever? So can we kind of go through all that and then talk about the shoes? Is that possible?
sure, sure. So,
Yeah.
I don't know that there's this, people always want a simple answer to these things, and there's not a
Mm,
simple answer to it.
yeah.
But we do know that running injuries are really a modern phenomenon. So if you go back and look in PubMed and you type in the word running, INGUR, so it could be injuries or
Mm,
injury, single. If you do that, you will come up with a histogram of the number of publications that
yeah.
have been written on running injuries, and it starts around the 70s, right? And
Oh,
it goes up and
okay.
it goes up.
Okay.
Prior to 1970, there were none really. If you look at that histogram, no articles on running injuries. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't happen at all, but they
Oh,
weren't prevalent enough that people were writing about them, right? So,
all right.
so I think we are doing something wrong. We can get into this later, but I think that if we're not running the way that we were adapted to run, that's
All
going to
right.
get us in trouble. And I think that's really what's happened is that we have a mismatched theory of evolution, which says
All
that
right.
that
Mm-hmm.
our bodies, our environment is changing faster than our bodies can adapt. So we have the same bodies, really,
Yes.
we had
Yes.
2 million years ago, right? And
Uh,
we evolved in a way that allowed us to move, to walk, to run without anything, without any shoes at all. And then we had this environment that changes, and it's faster than what our bodies can adapt to, so that we're now mismatched with our environment. And it's not just in musculoskeletal
mm,
injuries, it's our cardiovascular health, it's diabetes, it's obesity, it's all of those things. So I don't think it's just the grass or stretching or not stretching. I think that
yes.
it's a big part of it is that we're not running the way we were adapted to run. And then we were adapted to run, when you think about it, we ran so that because we were trying to chase down animals, right? We started
Yes.
running 2 million years ago when our brains were getting bigger and we needed meat. And all we had were clubs. We didn't have spears at the time. This is my evolutionary biologist
Mm,
tell me. And so we needed to outrun our prey, right?
yes.
And
All
so
right.
we evolved to run, but we were running like sprints and then stopping, kind of like high interval training. We
Yep.
weren't running 26 miles on a certain surface the same way,
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
didn't run
Okay.
that way. We
Well,
were
guess
running
what? Guess what?
yeah.
We're not doing it the way I said then. We're not doing it that way. Let's start the way let's start this way and say, why are we getting injured? And I guess you're going to say, so yeah, let's turn
We're
around.
not running the way that we were. I mean,
Exactly.
running wasn't an exercise back then. It was
Hmm.
a means of survival.
Survival.
And there were no
Yeah.
gyms back then, right? There were no gyms at all.
No.
So everything that we did kept our bodies strong and
Yeah,
gave us
exactly.
motion. We're climbing, we're lifting, we're squatting. All those things that we were doing before are what maintained that
When we're
range of
hunters
motion.
and gatherers.
We
Exactly.
were hunters and gatherers, and we were hunter and gatherers for the 90% of our history. I think we were hunters and gatherers.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
So
So it's just made
yeah.
total sense to me. And yes, so we need to talk about that, and then at the end say, okay, what about grass? What about, you know, this shoe or that shoe, and warming up and stretching and all that stuff. Okay, so we got to turn it around. And I've just even realized when you were saying that you know, we were sprinting and stopping and that, the funny thing is we've imposed our weird way of doing things onto even animal studies. So when you do a study with rats and mice, you actually run them on the treadmill, and you just run them continuously and things. But when you get a running wheel, they get on there and they go whoop, they sprint, and then they get off. They sprint and they get off. They don't just get on there and just go all day. So we've imposed that way of thinking even in our animal studies. And the weirdest thing was I saw a documentary on rats and mice, and they don't even run like the way we make them run. They hop. So yeah, you actually look at rats, they hop. They don't actually run like that. So it's just totally weird. All right. So
Can I
so
just
now I'm
share
really
with you
depressed
from
because I
that?
think I should never have got shoes. And that's probably why I've been injured forever. But yeah, sorry.
It does, but I mean, you're not really wrong by saying that in a sense. So, for the past 2 million years, right? We've been running for 2 million years. We've only had cushioned motion
Yeah,
control
50
shoes for the
years.
last 50. The 50
Yeah,
years,
we haven't
all of
adapted.
us have been in existence and think that this is the norm. But we've
Yeah.
said you do 50 over 2 million. That's only a 0.2
Mm,
something percent of
tiny.
our time. Or to say it the other way, we have lived 99.99975% of our time barefoot or in minimal shoes. So
Yes.
that's what we're adapted for. We have
We're totally
everything
back to
in our
front.
feet that we need to be able to walk and run without anything.
And now we think we're, you know, because I've had these cushioned shoes, and I think I'm a bit of a genius because I've bought these minimalist shoes, when actually that's, you know, I haven't really tried them out properly. Okay, so let's go through that then. So, all right. Well, I think that's just, for me, that's the takeaway message. We're done. Okay, thanks for that. Because
And
that's
so
your takeaway message, right?
I know,
Yeah.
and so, you know, I've spent my when I see patients now, my job is to try to get them back closer to the way that we're adapted to move. And so to me, it's not because it's a fad, it's not because it's, you know, barefoot running or foot running, or even landing on the ball of our feet, which I really think is also the way we're adapted to run.
Yeah.
It's not because it's a fad, it's because it's closer to the way that we move.
Exactly.
And the closer you are to the way we adapted to move, the lower the risk for injury.
Holy
And
crap. All right. Well,
right?
it's that simple. I feel like an ignoramus. And the
Well, no, it is,
annoying
to me,
thing is
it's
I was a
very
distance
simple.
runner. I was a distance runner and I got injured years ago. And every time I try and get back, I get injured. And then I think, oh. And it's like
But think
now I
about
just
it.
think, dude, I mean,
People who run trails don't get injured as much as people who run on roads.
mm,
Now, why do you think that is?
yeah, exactly. All right. So then people are going to say it's the hard surfaces, right? Not the shoes. So why don't you explain that to us?
So the reason that people who run on trails get injured less is because they are on uneven. It's not as consistent. There's much more variability in running on trails than there is running on the road. And these are overuse injuries. That means they're overloaded, overuse. You're loading the same tissues in the same way every single time. So
Yes.
when you're out on the trail, you're running, you're gonna jump over the stick and you're gonna run here and your ankle turns this way and this way. And so the loading is much more variable. And that's why I believe that there's less. And there's been studies that have shown that you have less rate, injuries are less prevalent in people who run trails versus people who run roads. Now, running roads, it's not necessarily the hardness of the surface, it's just the consistency of the lack of variability,
Yes, it's the same.
I believe.
All
Right.
right. Now that,
And
funnily enough, okay, because it's all about me, sorry. Because you know, I got injured and I knew that. I think people know that, right? They go, okay, it's good to mix it up, run on grass, run on the road, run uphill, downhill, run fast sometimes, slow sometimes, run on this side of the road, that side of the road, do the track one way 1 week and the other way. People know that, right? But the thing that freaks me out is the shoes, right? But you keep going, right? So the important thing is you don't always. So because I know my daughter always gets shin splints, or you get what's the other one? Iliotibial band friction syndrome. And I always just say it's because you're running at the same speed, the same surface, the same everything. So it's just the same, the iliotibial band's rubbing the same every time. So you're saying that's an important thing, yeah? To mix it
I
up.
think it doesn't matter which injury it is. Everyone has their Achilles heel, so to speak. Like everybody has something like, that it's their knee that tends to go first. They start to the nick of the knee, or it's my Achilles, or it's my plantar fascia, or it's my T band, or it's my hip. Everybody has their thing, but depending on their structure, how they move, their alignments. So it's hard to know exactly. I mean, there's some studies that show some relationships between structure and mechanics and injury, but that's really why. But it's variable across people. However, the variability of loading is important for any injury. It doesn't matter what injury it is. And in fact, I'm a big advocate of people moving in multi directions. So multi-directional sports, especially when kids are young. Like, I am not an advocate of kids just running, because it's in one direction. It's the same issue, right? They're running in one direction.
Different sports and different.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Whereas when you're in the field sports and the court sports, where you're moving in different directions, you're loading your bones, your joints, muscles. And so you get strong really in multi directions. The bones are stronger.
Makes so much sense.
Yes, it does.
It does.
So I'm all about multi-directional movements. It's really important. And I think as we get older, probably even more important, because as we get older, we tend to do stuff just linearly. Like, you watch little kids, they're running all over the place in all kinds of directions.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
as adults, you start to you walk, and you're
not.
Yeah.
I'm a cyclist. I'm a runner. I'm a this. I'm a that. I'm a
cycling,
swimmer.
I like to cycle, but yeah.
And that's why. Sorry, you go.
Well, I'll finish. So what I was going to say is that's why pickleball is such a great sport for people who are, it's not just people who are older. Really, it's become very, very popular. But tennis, you're moving in different directions. You're loading yourself in different directions.
Why don't you tell us what pickleball is? Because I think that's a thing that's bigger in the States. That my wife had to explain it to me.
Yeah, so pickleball is a game. My husband and I really just picked it up, but it's a game that's sort of between racquetball and tennis, maybe. You're playing with a wiffle ball in a sense. It's got some holes in it, but it does bounce, but it does not have the same bounce as a tennis ball. So if you're used to playing tennis, it takes some time to get used to it. And you're playing on a shorter court, with a little bit lower net. And so there's just different rules. I don't want to get into all that, but there's different rules. But it's a great game because you're moving and stopping, and it's just
so much of this. So much of this makes sense, because I remember. Okay, again, I'm going to, because I'm this bitter and twisted, injured guy forever. I try and go for a run, and I might get through 20 minutes the first day, or 10 minutes or something, because build up slow, it's fine. Next day, 20 minutes, okay, great. Next day, 20 minutes. After like 100 meters, my calf goes, right? It just tweaks, and it's like, and then I'm limping for a few days, but then you go and play tennis, it's fine. And you say, hang on, how could it be? How could I play tennis like first time in 3 years, and I don't get injured? But then I go out for a run, and it just makes perfect sense, because you're doing the same stupid movement over and over that caused injuries years earlier, and you're surprised now, especially 10 years older.
Are you a heel striker, you think?
Yeah, generally.
Yeah.
So I don't try and stop it and all that. Yeah.
Heel strikers have got weak calves. You don't have to use your calf as much as when you land on the ball of your foot. When I have someone that's a natural forefoot striker come into the clinic, they seldom have weak calves. When I have rear foot strikers come into the clinic, they almost always have weak calves, because you just don't have to use them in the same way. You're not using them in the way that they're adapted to be used.
Oh, okay, that's perfect. Because before we came on air, you said you actually think you should land. The more natural way is to land on the ball of your feet. So if people hear you say, well, if you've got weak calves, that's because you land on the ball of your feet, they might think, oh, I should try and force myself to land on the front of my foot. But you're not saying that. So did you want to talk, we're sort of all over the place because of me, because of the way I started off, but did you want to go back and say, how were we actually born to run? And and what's gone wrong, and what happened in 1970s, we could probably guess. But
Sure.
yeah.
So, like I said, I think running, to me, running's not a sport. It's an activity of daily living. And if you look at children, you don't have to teach them how. It's not like skiing or volleyball. You don't have to teach them. They can run. Now, can you make them a better runner? Sure, probably better form, but you can make walkers better walkers as well. I mean, I've seen some terrible walking form. And so it's something that evolved for us to be able to survive. Like I said, we had to go out, we had to get our meat because our brains were getting bigger. And so the body, there's a wonderful paper by Dennis Bramble and Dan Lieberman called, the title of the article is Born to Run. And it talks about the differences between Homo erectus, Australopithecus, last walking man, and Homo erectus, the first running man, okay? And the differences in the body. And we changed so that we could adapt to running. And some of it has to do with like the long Achilles. You have a long Achilles because you need that to store and release energy. You don't need that for walking, but you need it for running. You have a larger joint surfaces because the forces are larger. You need to distribute them. There were 26 markers of endurance running that differentiated walking man from running man. And even things like the nuchal ligament that holds your head up. A pig who walks doesn't have one, but a horse does because they run. And it went through a lot of these different changes in our body. So we have a big calf. Think about this. We have a big calf and a small anterior tib. That's the muscle in the front of the shank. Front of the lower leg is your anterior tib.
It's hard to even find it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, some people have big ones, but the calf is there to be able to, when you land on the ball of your foot, it helps to decelerate the heel downward, and then it helps with the propulsion in the second half of stance. So the first half of stance, it's lowering your heel down in a controlled way, and then it's pushing you off, right? So that's important. Now, when people run, and I'll talk about how that changed, but people who run in cushioned shoes, 95% of them are landing on their heel. And when you land on your heel, you've got to lower the front of your foot down first, right? Because you're laying on your heel. And that muscle that does that is the anterior tib. It's the one in the front of the lower leg. And when you first start out, it's not trained. And this is why people get what's called shin splints, is that you're actually overusing this anterior tib. It's not designed for running. Your calf is designed for running primarily. I mean, they both work when you're running, but I'm just saying the primary mover in terms of the lower leg is the calf. And so we basically ran in a way that allowed us to run in multiple directions and not get injured. And I'm sure people got injured. I'm never going to say never or never say always, but in general, we didn't have the problems that we're having today. And then what happened in terms of running injuries, when you see that big change, right, in the 1970s, what happened in 1970? Do you remember?
Running boom.
Right.
Yeah. So people are going to say, well, the reason there weren't injuries because no one was running.
It's true. So what happened in the running boom is that prior to that, the people who were running were people who were in track clubs, cross country, high school teams, college teams, club teams, right? And I guess there were professional athletes then too running, not the average Joe. And then the running boom came about around 70, and all of these individuals wanted to run. And the only shoes that were available were the racing flats, basically. They're called plimsolls. They had like just a rubber sole and basically kind of canvas to keep the shoe on the foot. And they were basically minimal shoes until 1970. That's why when people get all excited about minimal shoes, I'm like, no, this is how we were running before, right? But they couldn't run in these flats because they'd been walking around in 2-inch heels, and now their heel is coming down and that puts a load on their Achilles. So they were getting Achilles tendinopathies or Achilles
Sorry. So people in the 70s were walking around on 2-inch heels?
Well, just like the heel of a shoe, or maybe 1-inch, 2-inch, like a regular shoe, like a man's shoe even has a little bit of a heel to it.
But not that much, right? Okay.
Well, maybe an inch and a half,
Okay.
depending. Say an inch, okay? But they had a heel. Their foot was out. Their heel was elevated to some
the fact
degree.
that the back was elevated. Yeah, the back is elevated. Yeah.
Because there was a heel in the shoe. Maybe not 2 inches.
Yeah, you know what I guess I was thinking, but yeah, it makes me think now. When you're wearing like dress shoes, whatever. Yeah, even the men's has a bit of a raised heel. Yes,
that's right. And women did, and sometimes they were more chunky. Anyways, now they're running and their foot has to come all the way down. And now they've got to control that with the back of the
I see.
calf, which is the Achilles and the calf, the gastrocnemius,
Yes.
and it overloaded it. So they had Achilles problems. They also did not know how, they weren't trained, so they didn't know how to cushion their landings. These runners were running with no cushioning at all. They learned to use their body to cushion their landings.
Yeah, the track runners.
The
Yeah,
track
exactly.
runners did. But these individuals who just started out, they didn't know how to cushion their landing, and their foot was going into more pronation because they didn't know how to control the rolling in of their foot. You do roll in a little bit, but you don't want to excessively roll in.
Yes, yes.
It takes muscular control to prevent that from happening. So they were getting injuries. Nike actually noticed that there was these injuries, and they called these 3 very famous sports podiatrists who see a lot of runners with injuries. And the sports podiatrist said, we've got to, give them a heel to toe drop because that'll relieve the stress on the Achilles tendon. Got to add cushioning because they can't cushion themselves. We need to add control. And there goes the motion control cushioning shoe with a heel to toe drop. Those are how those got in there. So my hypothesis is that what they did is they rather than adapt the runner to the sport, they adapted the shoe to the runner. And then it just got worse and worse and worse. We got more and more and more cushioning till the Hoka. We got more and more support till the Brooks Beast. We've got heel to toe drops. And so, it changed the way that we ran, because now that you have a cushion under your heel, now you're going to land on your heel because it doesn't hurt. And for a given cadence, if you have a longer stride length, you can go faster. And so people basically gravitate towards a longer stride when they have cushion under the heel. Now, what we don't have is high speed film to show how people were running back in the day, whether we go back to the 1900s or whatever. Because you need high speed film to be able to see exactly where they're landing. But if you look at things like, I have found pictures of Greek vases that go back BC, and these Greek runners, and they're landing on the ball of their foot. Tapestries that show runners landing on the ball of their foot. So, and there's lots of reasons why landing on the ball of the foot actually there are advantages to it. Number one, it reduces the load to the knee. We know that when you run and land on the ball of your foot, you get less loading of the knee, more loading of the ankle and the calf, less loading of the quad and the knee.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I got mixed up. I think earlier I said you were saying that landing on your heel was good. You're actually saying naturally you should be landing on the ball of your feet, which is what you see the fast runners tend to, on average, land on the ball of their feet.
And when you land on the ball of your foot, you reduce the load to the knee, and the knee is the most common site of injury for runners, right? So that's part of the problem. You reduce the load to the front of the leg, so anterior compartment is something that would be reduced. You strengthen the foot muscles. You strengthen the calf muscles. You reduce load, the impact load that you have when you land.
All right.
You reduce it by 30 to 50%.
Yeah, well, okay, because I sort of got it back to front somehow. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think when you think about the strain on the Achilles, you said the knee, but in my simplistic, because I'm not a biomechanist, it feels like you're, and I've seen something on this, when you land on your heel, the force and everything is like really sharp, like it's really fast, and it's not spread out. When you land on the more front of your foot, the ball of your feet, the load, the force is more sort of spread out, right? It's not such high force.
If we look at the vertical ground reaction force, it's like a glove. When you land on your heel, you have an impact peak, and then you have a kind of gradual peak. It's called a propulsive peak. That's a rear foot strike pattern. Here's a forefoot strike pattern. It's just a nice smooth curve. You don't have this impact.
That's initial impact. So for those not watching on YouTube, so sometimes people say, I didn't realize you could watch it on YouTube. So people are used to podcasts, just listening to them, not watching. So so you had your thumb. Why don't you just explain for the people not watching?
The thumb is that impact force.
Yes.
If we're looking at this is a force curve. You have an impact and then a propulsive peak. Now there's a lot of people And Brian might be one of them, I think, if you have a chance to talk to him. Some of my colleagues, we
Yes.
debate whether rear foot striking is bad. I'm not going to say it's bad. I'm just going to say it is not the way we're adapted to run. Because people will argue with me and say, Irene, 95% of runners are rear foot strikers. And I say, if they were in
they had a
minimalist
shoe on.
or barefoot,
Yeah.
you would not see that.
Okay.
It's a
Okay.
much softer landing if you land on the ball of your foot, but you've got to train for it. You've got to strengthen the foot. You've got to strengthen the calf. You've got to strengthen the muscles primarily from the knee down so that you can then adapt to that kind of running pattern. You've got to let the musculoskeletal system adapt.
Okay. So just thinking about it. So you're saying the fact that you've got a shoe with this fat cushioning on it, it just makes sense that when you're swinging your leg forward, it's just, you're going to hit that first because you've got that sort of inch or, for the us metric types, 2.5 centimeters or so, or more even, under your foot. So naturally that's going to land first. You're saying if that's not there, you'll tend to land on your forefoot more. Is that
Your
right?
knee, your foot comes underneath your knee, right? So it's not way outstretched, which
Yes.
reduces other loads, other torques that are further up, like your knee and your hip. So you want your foot underneath your knee when you land.
Yes.
Or
And when you land, sorry,
but
what? Sorry.
it could be slightly in front of it. It's not exact, but you don't want your foot far really outstretched. That's
Exactly.
not a position for you.
And that's where people have started talking about, don't overstride. So when you overstride, because sometimes people think, oh, I'll go faster if I make each stride further, which makes sense if you have the same, running rate and your stride length's further. But that's not good. And because when you stride out, you're going to be more likely to land on your heel.
You're going to land on your heel. You're going to have
and
an
your
impact
knee will be
force.
behind.
Yep. And you're going to have this impact force that you don't have when you land on the ball of your foot. People say, well, what's the big deal about that little impact force? You land 1,000 times per foot per mile. If you run 20 miles a week, that's 20,000 impacts per foot per mile. And if you do that over the course of a year, it's 1 million of these impacts per foot per mile over all that time. So it's and if you watch someone who's a forefoot striker, they just have a smoother gait. I can see them from a distance and know they're a forefoot striker.
Now you mentioned the Hoka, because my wife just got Hokas, and people that get Hokas, oh, I love it because it's so comfortable and cushioning and whatever. So how do we get around that? Because I guess the problem is, they're going to go, oh, this is so uncomfortable. It's so comfortable. If I go to a minimalist shoe, it's so uncomfortable. So they've just got to get used to it. Yeah. So they've got to do very slow.
Yeah. The more you put on your body, the less you use your body, right? The more the more support you give it. It's like the Barco lounger chair. Yeah, they're great to sit in, but if you sit in those all the time, my mother, I watched her get weaker and weaker to the point where she couldn't get up out of the chair. She was getting older and her core was not very strong. And I said, Mom, you can't sit in that chair all the time. You need to use your core to get yourself up.
So I guess what's happening there is you're not using, because when you say you're running on different surfaces and things, you're actually having to use all these different muscles in your foot, stabilizing and things.
And your leg.
And your leg.
We should talk about this because a lot of people think, oh, well, back in the day when we were in barefoot, we didn't have these hard surfaces. Well, the first thing I want to say is, if you've read the book Born to Run, have you read that book?
I haven't actually.
Okay, it's a fun read, and it talks about the Tarahumara, and that means running people, right? They run everywhere. Their communities were like a couple 100 miles apart, and they would run to these communities. So they were running in the copper canyons of Mexico. So sometimes on hard packed dirt roads, sometimes on rocks and canyons, right? They were running, and they ran in these Huarache sandals that were fashioned out of tires, like old discarded tires with rawhide straps to keep them on the feet. That's what they ran in. No cushioning at all.
Yeah, I've seen
the
that.
reason for that is that when you run on a hard surface, you soften your leg spring. You actually become more compliant. And when you run on a soft surface, you make your legs stiffer. And here's an example. You're going to jump off a 2-foot platform and you're going to land on a hard concrete surface. How are you going to land? Are you going to land with your knees stiff and your...
No.
because you would get this
You gotta
jolt.
give. Yeah, exactly.
Right? You got to give. When you land in sand, you've got to stiffen or you're
Stiffen
going to
up.
clap
Mm.
sand. So when you put something, now take that analogy, and you're going to put it between your body and the ground. Like, so if you put something soft between the body and the ground, you're going to stiffen, you're going to hit harder. And when you don't have anything on your, it's going to hurt if you land hard. You're going to land soft, but that takes more muscle and it takes time to build that
So you need
muscle.
to adapt to it.
Interesting, really interesting study. There was a study looking at tibial shock. So they put a little accelerometer on the ankle, and the shock tells you, again, how hard you're landing. It gives you a sense of the impact. And you land on, they had people running on grass compared to running on a dirt path, compared to running on sort of concrete. Where do you think that tibial shock was highest?
Yeah, exactly. On the softest surface.
Nope.
No, because I thought you were saying when it's soft, you have to stiffen up.
It's really a trick question. It's a trick question, so don't feel bad. So basically, there was no difference in
No difference.
shock when they landed on grass versus a path versus like a concrete road.
Okay. Because you would think concrete. I was just trying to like do the reverse thing.
You would. And that's what everyone always says is concrete.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because you are changing your leg spring because of the surface you're coming in contact with. Now, if you're not trained to run on that hard surface, because it takes some eccentric activity of the muscles to be able to attenuate that, you attenuate those loads through the muscles. If you're not able to do that for long periods of time, then running on hard surfaces, eventually you're not able to do it. So you can't make your leg pliant. It's getting tired, so you make it stiff, and now you're getting jolted. So it's really the training on those hard surfaces, because there are people, Abibi Kabal, how was it?
Abibi Bikila.
Bikila, sorry, thank you.
Yeah, 1960 Olympics.
Right. And he ran that barefoot.
Barefoot. And then the second time in Tokyo, he ran with shoes on.
I know.
Because they said, oh, poor guy, couldn't afford shoes. Yeah.
I know, but I'm just telling you, you can run 26 miles on hard surface with no shoes and no cushioning.
You know what's really weird is because I keep talking about me, which is bad. But when I was a kid, say from 0 to 4, I lived in New Zealand. Then we moved to Fiji for 5 years, right? And Fiji, third world country, especially back then. We were all just running around. All my friends were, the local Indians and Fijians. We were just all running around in bare feet, and it was unsealed roads. So it was just gravel and everything. And we were just running in bare feet and all over the place. And I used to do this trick. I'd put out, I'd light a match, which I don't know why I had this when I was 8 years old anyway, but light a match and put it out on the sole of my foot so it wouldn't hurt because it was that hard, right? So I was actually, I should have just kept all that. Because, kept doing that. Yeah, exactly. So what's interesting is with the born to run, and it's Mexico, right? Yes. Why do they even do the old? Because obviously they wouldn't have had rubber wheels previously. Why do they even do that? Why don't they just run in bare feet? Did they used to?
It's a good question. I think the reason that if you look at the very first shoes that were found 10,000 years ago, it was made out of sagebrush bark as a platform with some strapping from, the trees and whatever vines, strapping to keep it on the foot, right? Yes. Because even back then, that was 10,000 years ago, it was to protect the foot from like sharp things and, cuts. And that's why I tell people, I tell people you should spend some time running barefoot, we're barefoot on hot, warm bricks. Oh my gosh, it feels so good. I used to run like in Back Bay and Beacon Hill in Boston. It was all like a lot of bricks and stuff. And I used to like, because it's really smooth too. But running on like really, sharp surfaces, and especially if you're running a marathon, you don't want to cut your foot.
You don't want to cut your foot
on the way. So I really think that you need to put something on to protect your feet. So I think
enough to stop you from cutting. So if you're like running a cross-country race, remember Zola Budd as well from South Africa. She ran barefoot.
Yes, she did.
But yeah, running, and even now you'll see, well, I shouldn't say even now. See, I've got this in my head that it's kind of primitive somehow to run in bare feet, which is obviously wrong. But people, you'll see if it's a cross country race and you know there's probably not going to be anything to cut yourself on, you know, you'll see people running in bare feet. But you're saying if it's any chance of having a surface that you're going to cut yourself on, like running on whatever, you just want a thin layer to stop yourself from being cut. That's all you want.
Yeah, I think it's actually almost more dangerous to run barefoot in grass. And the reason I say this is you don't see it. You don't see what's underneath. Whereas if you're running on a street, you see a piece of, if you're paying
Glass.
attention,
Exactly.
you have to be much more aware when you run barefoot too. And people always say that.
Sure.
You can't, it's like, you know, running with shoes, cushion shoes, become very lazy in your running. You just, you can run and not be aware.
Okay.
Whereas when you're barefoot, you have to be really aware. And when you see a rock, the minute you start to step on a sharp rock, you have this sort of automatic reaction where the foot comes up, unless you're just really not expecting it. I mean, certainly you can cut your foot, but that's why I think it's good to have the option. It's not the same as barefoot. You mentioned that earlier, maybe before we got started. Shoes, you know, the minimalist shoes do take away some of the sensory input that you have when you're barefoot. But all the other parts of it, not having the cushioning and not having the control and all of that, there's certainly, you still get a lot of the benefits of barefoot while protecting your foot.
It's funny because we had a fantastic distance runner called Lisa Martin. She became Lisa Ondieki. She married a Kenyan distance runner. Anyway, I remember she used to always run in racing flats. So I thought of that straight away when you said, you know, back in the 70s that the only people running were really, she used to run in racing flats the whole time. So, you know, she was doing 200 Ks a week, so 120 miles a week. She won the Commonwealth Games marathon and she was second in the Olympics in Seoul. And she always ran in racing flats. And I remember at one stage when I kept getting injured, I thought, you know, because I'd wear racing flats when I was racing. And I never got injured in the race. But then when I was training, I'd have these fat shoes and I'd get injured. And I thought maybe I should run like her.
It's weird
flats.
because, it's interesting because in, you know, when you're on a cross country team, for example, they'll have you train in like regular shoes and they have you race in the racing flats, which I don't think is a great idea because you run differently. When you put a shoe on, it'll change the way that you run. And again, if you're used to having cushioning, you're going to hit harder. And then you put a pair of racing flats on and, you know, you might end up, you know, at least for a while, hitting really hard. So it just doesn't make sense to me either. I think that we be running in shoes that allow the foot to do what it's supposed to do, but protect it. That's what I think. Now, unfortunately, we've gotten to the point now where we have the Nike 4% shoe that adds more energy to the system. And so we're not going to get the genie back in the bottle. People, we have definitely seen times improve with the advent of this new advanced footwear technology. I'll call it AFT. And it's, you know, I again, you're not going to get the genie back in the bottle, but where does it stop for one? Like just in terms of competitions, I mean, does it stop when can you put a jet propulsion in the midsole? And, you know, where does it stop where you're actually looking at the person's performance as opposed to all of the extra stuff that they put into the system? And World Athletics is worried about that as well. They want the person up on the podium to be there because of their own abilities and not because of anything augmented. So I'm worried about that, but I'm also worried about injuries because these shoes have got they're thick soled. They've got big flares on them, and the big flares create forces, turning forces. They're called torques. They create increased torques on the foot, the knee, and the hip that can become problematic and lead to injury. So we don't even know yet what these, because again, I say this, the farther you get away from the way that we're adapted to run, the greater the risk for injury.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So the 4%, they talk about 4%, and I don't know if it is, we can, is it roughly 4% less energy that you're using with these?
Yes.
You know? Yeah. So, but the question I had was, well, what about the injury rates? Are there higher injury rates or whatever? So I guess
we don't have that data yet. I don't think they've been out long enough. There haven't been any studies that I know of to date that have looked at that, but I predict there is one study It was just a case series of maybe 5 runners who had just transitioned to those shoes that have the plate in them and then the foam. And they all it was a case series of navicular stress fractures. Because when you think about these, and I don't know whether it's the foam or the actual plate, the plate actually provides some stability to the shoe and leverage. It's really the foam that provides the energy return. But if you've got a stiff plate and it doesn't bend in synergy with your foot, I can see how there could be abnormal forces are created in the foot that could lead to something like a bone stress injury. So again, minimal shoes, they just let the foot do what it's supposed to do. They're very wide because the foot really needs to spread, and a lot of shoes don't allow that. And they just, again, take advantage of all of that the foot has in terms of its performance.
And when you say you can't put the genie back in the bottle, well, maybe if there are increased injuries and things like that, then maybe people will move away from them. I'm wondering if because obviously these people turn up, you don't think that'll happen. You think it's too late?
I think the performance is what's really going to keep them going. Yeah.
But I guess you can't perform if you do 4% faster,
but
you get injured all the time. You can't turn up to the race and you can't train. That's probably more than 4%. But I wonder, do you know if these people train in them, or they train in kind of normalish shoes, which are still fat shoes?
I think and then
they just race in those.
It's mixed. So I know people that train in them, they wear out very quickly. That foam very quickly. So they don't have a lot of miles in them, and they're very expensive. Yeah. So I think that some people do train in them and run in them, and some people just race in them.
Maybe that's how they get away with it. Because how, the funny thing was I never got injured in a race. So somehow, even though I was training in more normal running shoes and then racing in racing flats, maybe it's just so different because you're kind of going faster and all this stuff. Maybe it's so different that you get away with it. So maybe they're getting away with it by training in normal shoes. But as you say, normal shoes aren't the greatest anyway. And then racing in these, I don't know, because as you say, now I just wanted you to explain more. So you said you get these torque. So because they're flared, so again, if people aren't watching, you're talking about just sort of, the sideway, the inside and outside of flared. I guess you're saying that then you're more likely to land on the outside of your foot and pronate more. So maybe if you can just say what pronation is for people that don't know, and then what
when you land on the outside of your foot, whether you're landing on your heel or the ball of your foot, and then your foot rolls in, and then as you roll forward off your toes, your foot rolls off and you push off. Yep. And so that rolling in is important. That's called pronation, that rolling in of your foot. It's important for shock attenuation and adapting to uneven surfaces. It's an important component. But if you do it, the magnitude's too great or the velocity's too high of moving in that direction, that can cause problems. And when you put flares on the shoe, it increases the moment arm, basically the lever arm, let's say, increases the lever arm and increases the torque on the foot, which can increase that velocity or degree of pronation.
So you're pronating maybe more and faster as well, yeah?
Yes.
And people tend to think, this shoe is anti-pronation. You don't want to pronate. But as you're saying, pronation is normal, but you don't want excessive.
That's right.
Pronation, yeah. All right. And then the other one is supination. Yeah.
Yep.
Which is
that's being too far on the outside. So, and people who supinate tend to, their heels are rolled outward, their knees tend to roll outward, not always, because again, you never say always, never say never, but those are the people kind of bow-legged and they walk on the outside of their feet, as opposed to pronation tends to be more linked with a knee valgus, that sort of knock knees, your knees come in closer together as your feet roll in. But, either one of those can be problematic.
It's funny because, again, sorry, it's always about, so I've got the bow legs, the tibial varus.
It tends to be more male dominated. That's a more male pattern.
And I always thought, that's why I get injured all the time, whatever. But then you'll just see all these different runners, like you can't just predict that. You'll see this I think his name's Kichalka. No, anyway, he's like one of the best runners in the world, the Ethiopian. He has some really bow legs, and you'll see other people, they'll be landing on their really looking weird, like supinate, like, how you see sometimes they're fast and they're not just landing on their forefoot, but it's like their toes are splayed out as well. And, all this like really weird stuff. So I guess, you can't predict. That's okay. This is where I'm heading in a strange way, is whether you should change things or not. So, the classic thing is,
Yes.
Michael Johnson, when he was the best 200, 400 runner in the world and all this, he would lean back, and people were like, oh, if he leaned forward, he'd be faster. And you say, well, hang on, he's the world record holder. I think he's doing all right. And so I've always had this thing in my head that because people have such different running gaits and they look different things, and they can be really fast, I tend to think just leave it. Don't try and change it, because again, that's how that's how you adapted and whatever. But I think I've seen somewhere that you do tend to think you can change your gait. And so, what did you want to?
But I think you need to have a reason to do it, right? I used to think the same thing. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And I have a little bit different feeling about that too, and I'll talk about that afterwards as to why. But the people that come to me are broke, right? The people that come to see me are because they've got running injuries. And so the first part of my career was really based on trying to understand the relationship between abnormal movement patterns that I think are related to the fact that we're not matched to the way we were adapted to move,
Yeah,
not just
exactly.
with like sitting, our chronic sitting, right? That affects our
Which
all
we're
of
not
that.
designed for either. Yeah,
We're
exactly.
not. We're supposed to squat, right? We weren't really designed to sit. So I think if you establish a relationship between a particular mechanic and injuries, like for example, in patellofemoral pain, I've studied people who have anterior knee pain, the front of their patella joins their femur.
Yep.
And
Kneecap.
if you look at those groups, we find that a lot of them are related to having too much inward angulation of their femurs. So again, kind of towards a valgus position of the knee. So hip adduction, adduction, where the knees come in too much, right? Where they're real
Sorry. So
close.
just to clarify, because again, if people aren't watching, so you
I
mean
know.
you've got your knee, and then
Yeah.
then below the knee is coming in too much to the
No,
feet.
for you got your hips and your knees are coming in from your hips, and the knees are too close.
Okay, so like if you've got wide hips, for example, and then your knees
Yeah.
are coming in, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So that
But you don't
angle.
have to have wide hips. You can just have regular hips. It's just your knees are
So
coming in
knees are
too.
close together. Yes.
Knees are coming in too close together. And that's related to the development. We've got prospective data, which shows that when people have that, and you follow them, they get injured. They develop this anterior knee pain at a greater rate than people who don't have it. So,
Yes.
again, prospective data, we have retrospective data as well to show that people who have a history of that kind of pain have those kind of mechanics.
These
When
are
you
kind of
start
knock knee, people that are almost hitting their knees when they're running.
Yeah, exactly. And so for those people, and the people that have come to our clinic, really were people who have gone through 3 courses of physical therapy, have tried strengthening, have tried stretching, have tried changing their training, stopping, resting, and it keeps coming back. And when you have those kind of individuals, it indicates that there's an underlying issue. There may be an underlying issue that's not being addressed with strengthening, stretching, and just kind of slowing your training a little bit, or being gradual or resting. And so those are the individuals that we work on with retraining. And the retraining can be anything. I'm just going to give the example of the knock need, right? So what we do is we bring them in, and the first thing you need to do before you start retraining is you need to make sure that the body has the strength and the capacity necessary to make the change. So we do some strengthening to begin with, just to give them the capacity. And then they go through a 4-week program coming in 3 times a week where we give them feedback on what they're doing. So let's say it's this knock knee, right? Here's my knees. They're running in front of a mirror, and I tell them I want them to activate their glutes, and I want them to pull their knees apart when they run. It's not easy, but they can do it. I mean, I can show you some before and after
so it's
pictures.
not just running with your feet kind of wider or something.
No,
it's
a
a way.
Yeah, sometimes what depends on what the problem is. If someone's running with their toes toed in, you might want to get them to toe their toes out a little bit so that they're more
brings the
straight. So
knee
they're
out.
not, And if they're running really wide base, you can sometimes just get them to bring this in. But if it's a knee problem, you've really got to get them to activate their hips to move their thighs out so their knees are not coming
It must be
together.
hard.
It is hard. So that's why it takes time. And what you do is you give them feedback continually. That's the retraining. So you've got to give them feedback so that they can, like if Glenn, I have you on the treadmill and I say, okay, I want you to activate your glutes and I want you to see that your knees come apart. And you go, okay, I feel what that feels like. I know what I have to do to get that result. And you do that for a while. And then you start to fade the feedback. I turn the mirror around, or I put something in front of the mirror and say, okay, now I want you to do it without the mirror. So that you then rely on what you've developed, these internal cues. And so you slowly have to remove that feedback so that individuals will be able, because you're replacing, I'm trying to replace your old motor pattern, which was your knees coming in, with a new motor pattern, right? And you've done the old motor pattern so many
So
times.
long.
Yes. So not only do you have to,
Lay down the
provide
pathways in your
feedback,
brain.
you have to fade the feedback so that people can learn to do it on their own. And then you have to have them practice. So that's going outside. And after we do the 4 weeks of the retraining, then they have a 10-week program outside where they're actually slowly increasing their running and getting the practice. And we bring them in at 2 weeks and we bring them back in 4 weeks. I get on my soapbox when people tell me that they're doing retraining and they're basically getting someone up on the treadmill and saying, do this, right? And they can do it in front of you. And then they're expecting they're going to be able to do it when they go out.
You can't. No.
You can't, you have to own this pattern. You have developed this pattern over many, many years, depending on how old you are when you come to me. And so it takes time and effort because you want it to become automatic, this new pattern. You don't want to have to think about it. That takes time. And research has shown that when you give someone 100% feedback, that means I say, Glenn, you're doing great. Keep doing that. Keep doing that. You're doing great. I don't get you to do it on your own. That improves your performance. You can do it really well in front of me, but it impedes your learning. So I'm telling you all the time, just getting out there. And so when people come in and they get a couple of sessions of PT and they tell me that the person's retrained, I'm like, I don't believe that. I don't believe they're retrained. And there are ways of telling whether someone is retrained because they should be able to do it when they're distracted and they don't know they're being watched. It should carry over, that movement pattern should carry over to another environment. So if I train them on the treadmill, I should see that same pattern over ground. See what I'm saying? So there are ways of looking at that. So retraining is not for the meek at heart. It takes a real commitment and time. And you're really trying to undo what has been done over the years. And I believe that reason, in part, that people develop this sort of collapsing inward of their knees, it's lack of good core stability, lack of good glute strength, and your gluteal muscles. And that's from all the sitting that we do. And when I see people with feet that have like just excessive pronation and just really weak feet, it's from all the support that we're putting in our feet.
Shoes the whole time.
And wearing shoes all the time.
Actually, okay, that's interesting because my idea about changing gait was very simplistic. Like, I'll get Michael Jordan to lean forward, and someone that lands on the sole of the feet, make them land on the front. But that was much more, because that's more crude, right? And it's probably going to just mess everything up if you switch to that.
It depends on what it is. I mean, you have to know when the person comes to you. Like I had somebody who had medial knee pain on the inside of their knee, and they were running really toed out. When you run toe out, your medial knee is now in the plane where you're, it's in the sagittal plane. You're basically trying to bend your knee, but you're putting a lot of load on the medial side of the knee. Can you envision that? So you're running with your toe out and you're moving your weight over your foot. You put a lot of load on the medial knee.
Yeah, of course, because the front of your knee sort of wants to keep going.
Your front of your knee's now out to the side.
Out to the side,
and the inside of your knee is almost facing forward, and now it's getting all the load. This is the problem. Someone like that, it's very simple to get them to toe in.
Okay, but very gradually, I guess.
Yeah, so sometimes it's a toe in, sometimes it's a toe out. So I've done leans. I've had people do leans. So it doesn't matter. You just got to be able to know what the problem is, have a reason to change it, know how to change it, and then reinforce it.
I just realized I did my own gait retraining because when I first started running, I realized I was like kind of pigeon-toed. And I thought that's just not a cool look. So I slowly started changing that. But then I saw years later that Alberto Salazar, who who had the world record, and so this is great. We're going to have Derek Clayton on, this hasn't been released yet. He's a legend. So Derek Clayton ran 2:8:33 in 1969, and the world record then was 2:10. So it's not a bad record to
No.
break. And then that wasn't broken until 1981 when Alberto Salazar broke it. But anyway, Derek Clayton's going to be coming on at some stage, which is going to be awesome with a bunch of researchers. But anyway, so yeah, I remember because I saw later on that Alberto Salazar was running, toe in. It's like, oh, he seemed to do all right. But yeah, it just reminded me that I did change. So I guess if you do it slowly yourself, you may get away with it.
You can. And this is why I believed. So when I first started talking about changing gait patterns, I had virtual tomatoes thrown at me at a conference. I was pretty young and I was kind of taken aback. These are the people I respected. They thought I was crazy. You can't change it. It's automatic. You shouldn't change it. But I remember seeing as a PT, people telling me, this is just what you told me. My toe, I used to toe in, but I really worked on toeing out. And I thought, if people can do that, then you can change a motor. As long as you have the range of motion to be able to move in that direction, you can change a motor pattern. Once you can do it for even one step, it's just a matter of making it automatic, giving them the capacity to do many, many foot strikes and practicing it. And so using real-time feedback is really important because you see it immediately. You're watching yourself and you can make those minor adjustments to make sure you're doing what's right. But then you have
and it was easy for me because I could just look down and see if my toes were in or not.
That's exactly right.
But the one you were saying, that would be much harder, to try and see what you're doing with your knock knees and things. So
you have to do that with a mirror. Like this is why retraining on a treadmill is helpful because you're in one spot, you're not thinking about where you're running, and you can use a mirror. If we're looking at something from the side, we'll use a video camera with a screen in front of them so they can see. If it's in the back, it's the same thing. We've used EMG to try to get them with real-time feedback to try to get them to activate. We've used accelerometers to try to get them to soften their landing. So you can use all kinds of things for feedback.
Yeah, it's funny because I just realized that what you said people shouldn't do is what's happened to my daughter, because my daughter actually runs and she literally looks like she's knocking her knees. They sometimes touch, they sometimes don't. And they literally did. And we thought this was all high tech because we took her to someone, they videotaped her running. But all it was saying, oh, look, you do knock knee, pretty much. And then sort of said, oh, try not to do that. That's just not enough, right?
Not going to be able to do that. Yeah.
No, exactly. So, she tried a little bit and then sort of gave up. And okay. So, okay. Well, that's a bit from Melbourne to you. You'll fly around. Can we fly over? It's fine. You've got a big budget. Okay.
3 times a week for a month.
She flies over 3 times a week. Okay. It's going to be exhausting.
She has to come and stay.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. So, but you did say if it's not fixed, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So it would be only if you had recurrent injuries. Now, I can't help thinking, though, to tie it in with the running, with the shoes. So someone comes to see you and they're knock-kneed or they're whatever, and you say, oh, they've tried the strengthening and whatever. Isn't the most likely thing to drop the shoes, go to the minimalist shoes and get
So my approach is I feel like running with a rear foot strike pattern is as abnormal as walking on your toes. That's my feeling.
Yeah, right.
Like if you walked around toes, you'd say, oh, that's abnormal. We're not designed. I mean, we're designed to run on our heels on soft surfaces. Like people who actually are barefoot runners or barefoot people, they tend to have much more variable foot strike patterns. So if they're on a soft surface like grass when they're running, they might land on their heel. And if they're on a hard surface like concrete, they're going to land on the ball of their foot. However, people in shoes will always heel strike, no matter the surface.
Yeah, right.
Again, and then you don't have that same variability of loading. So I feel like I want to get people off their heels, and the best way to get them off their heels is, and I also want them to use their feet the way their feet were meant to be used. So the best way to do that is to get them into minimal shoes. So and again, never say always, never say never. There are people who are not appropriate. We could talk about that. I had one woman who had lost her toes and from a sepsis. And, so now she's got more load on the ball of her foot because she has toes. I didn't put her in minimal shoes, right? We did get her into a low profile shoe, didn't have a lot of heel to toe drop, didn't have a lot of flares. But, so you have to be reasonable about it. But I would say that the vast majority of people can run in minimal shoes if they can be patient, if they'll take the time to strengthen their feet.
So when people come in with fat shoes, they've had all these injuries, do you try and get them to go try the minimalist shoes
Yeah.
first before you try all these knock knees and glute, strengthen the
We
glutes or whatever?
it usually needs, we do both. So one of the first thing I need to do is get them off their heels and get them into the ball of their foot. We want to
You
get
mean
them
landing on the, sorry, what are you saying?
landing
So
on the
even with the
heel.
fat shoes, you're trying to get them to land
No, no, no.
on the ball of
My
their feet,
goal in their running pattern is to get them onto the ball of their foot.
even with the fat shoes? Or do
No,
you try,
no,
you
no.
get the minimal shoes? Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So my overall goal is to get them on the ball of the foot. The way that we do that
Is
is
minimal.
by getting them into minimal shoes and training them. Sometimes it takes a little bit of training because they still might try to land on their heels in the minimal shoes just because they've been doing it for so
Yeah, of
long.
course.
So it's really training and giving them the strength. And the strength is also the foot strength as well. So you've got there are 10 muscles in 4 layers in your arch. People don't realize that.
Wow.
10 muscles, 4 layers that originate and insert in your arch. I'm not talking about things like the muscles that start in your lower leg, like your posterior tib and your perineals. Talk about the
In the
muscles
foot itself.
in
Yeah.
the foot. Wow, there are 10. And those muscles help to control the deformation of your arch,
When
how
you
much
land.
and how fast. And when they're active, you have a much more stable foot. Well, people who run in minimal shoes have every single study that's been done, Glenn, everyone, when people transition to minimal shoes, their feet get stronger. And a recent study came out that showed that when you take healthy feet and put them into orthotics, which is a support, for 12 weeks, and then another group who just stayed in regular shoes, the group in the orthotics had a 10 to 17% reduction in the size of their muscles in 12 weeks. 12 weeks. And how many people only wear orthotics for 12 weeks? Right?
All
So
right.
why my philosophy is you're going to hear when you talk to different people, like I think the individuals that you're going to bring on, they've got a very different approach.
Yeah.
So for me, my approach is
Makes sense.
following kind of the way that we were adapted to move.
Exactly. Well, okay. So this is what actually one I had on my list was about orthotics, and I could kind of guess what you're going to say because you know what,
We can
my
talk
wife
about it.
my wife and I went because you know how you've got the soft orthotics that you can just get from the chemist, the pharmacist, and you warm them up and you sit down on them. Oh no, you got to have the hard orthotics. So we go to the podiatrist. And it just so happens that all 4 of us in my family, my wife, myself, my 2 daughters, we all need hard orthotics, of course. So, we're all wearing these. And it's funny because it sounds like I'm trying to make a comeback from my knucklehead start because it all makes sense now. I'd be wearing these orthotics and thinking, surely this can't be good because it's just holding you. My foot muscles aren't doing anything. And then when you walk around in sandals, for example, Birkenstocks and things, it's like, wow, my foot's having to work. I'm not used to this.
Exactly. It's like I was just going to say, it's like putting a neck brace on you for life.
Exactly.
Right? What would happen to those neck muscles? You wouldn't be able to hold your head up. It's the same thing. It's like, so yeah, I think the vast majority of people who are in orthotics don't need them. They don't need them. Now, if you have plantar fasciitis, so your plantar fascia, which is the last line of support in your foot, this connective tissue, when that gets very irritated, you might need to put something in there just to support it while it's healing.
Short term.
If I have a neck whiplash injury, I might want a neck brace, but you wouldn't keep it on for life.
Holy crap.
And that's the difference. But when all you have is a hammer, and I have a lot of great friends. If all you have is hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so everyone that comes into a podiatrist needs a orthotics, right? They don't love me for that, but there's some new, I think younger podiatrists who are coming up with a different mindset that maybe we need them temporarily and that we should be strengthening the foot. Look, think about those muscles. We need to strengthen them. And the best way to strengthen them, the easiest way is just to walk in minimal shoes. So we did a study looking at foot strengthening, like an exercise program for the arch of the foot and calf. And then compared that to a group of people who just walked in minimal shoes for 8 weeks, the same period of time. They built up slowly. And we looked at the size of the muscles using ultrasound. And guess what? Same difference, same strength increase. From strengthening the foot to walking in minimal shoes. Just simply walking in shoes.
Because walking in them is strengthening them.
It's an exercise. It's an exercise.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, it's funny because my wife literally went to the podiatrist like 3 weeks ago, and I literally said to her, I said, "This is ridiculous. We're all wearing orthotics," because I've sort of for some reason started to get over it and thinking why? Because you wear it when you're walking around, you wear it when you're running, you wear it all the time. I said, surely. And she came back. She goes, "Oh, I don't know if you pull the wool over my eyes, but he reckons I need new orthotics and all this stuff." So it's yeah. I could imagine they don't like you, the old school ones. But okay. So what do we do about this? So what do I? I'm going to get off this and go straight out and say to my wife, "Let's get rid of these orthotics and let's get minimalist shoes." And so it's actually given me hope because after years of being in this frustrated, so I said to you before we came on air that I used to be a serious distance runner and I had a knee injury. But anyway, as I got older and older, just whenever I try and run, my calf goes, my calf goes, my calf goes. I actually bought some minimalist shoes, but I don't know. I just didn't. So I didn't give it enough time and whatever. So
And
what
you've
do you
got to strengthen
suggest?
your calf. We do a lot of calf strengthening, and you can get online and get, you want to do single leg calf raises, double leg calf raises, then
Which
single
one?
leg, do them
Mhm.
off of a step. So you're going through greater range of motion, start to add some weights. You
Mhm.
need, and then start to do some plyometrics. Jump
Mm.
roping is great for the calf because it's an
Ooh,
eccentric,
yeah.
concentric. There's a lot of good, you need to build your calves and you need to build the strength and the endurance before you start running in minimal shoes. Remember I
And
told
walk around them first, I guess you said.
you, and
Mm.
yeah, definitely walk around them first because walking is really low risk unless you have plantar
Mm.
fasciitis. It might take you a little longer because you don't have any support and you're irritated there. But if you have pretty healthy feet and you don't have problems with your feet per se,
No.
you can get in minimal shoes. You're not going to want to go walk 5 miles in them right away, but you can walk around in them pretty easily without much risk. It's when you want to run in them. Because first of all, when you're running in them, you're changing your foot strike pattern, which loads your arch, your foot, your calf
Yeah.
more. Um, and so it's just, it takes longer to adapt to those. And your forces are higher, twice as high in running than in walking. So
Yes.
you've got to really be careful. You want to strengthen, build the capacity, and then gradually, very slowly build up your mileage in the minimal shoes.
All right.
Like
So
when
my
I first
mileage is
started,
0 at the moment. Sorry.
yeah, the zeros are good. Yeah. When
No,
I
no,
first
sorry.
started,
My mileage is 0.
oh, you
But yeah,
might,
the
yeah,
shoes
that's
I
actually
bought are 0 as well.
they're
Mhm.
that's my favorite patient because they're not wanting to go run 20 miles. Let's take it slow and let's just build your mileage running the way that I believe that you should be running. So
Perfect.
slowly, and I get people back running by if you're not injured at the time, by just doing a progressive running program. And there's all kinds of them. The one that we use a lot is you take 30 minutes and you walk briskly for 30 minutes in the minimal shoes. Once you can do that without any problems, you take that 30 minutes and you break it into 3 10-minute segments. And then each 10-minute segment, you run 1 minute, walk 9, run 1, walk 9, run 1,
Perfect. Perfect.
9, there's
Perfect.
30.
All right.
Then you slowly replace your walking with running. Do it slowly, gradually. If you have any tweaks, like your calf starts to tweak a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, back off a little bit and
Mm-hmm.
maybe take a day of rest and stay at that level. But then you eventually get to the point where you're running all 30 minutes and then you can
Mm.
start to increase your
Oh, I'm
time
excited.
and your distance and all
Okay.
that. But you got to give your body the time to adapt to it. And we are inherently impatient.
Oh, okay. I'm excited because I've actually got the 0 shoes already, but I just didn't know what I was doing. So just for others and me, I know everyone's different, but would you say you do the calf raises and things first, or you just start wearing it as the
I think you
minimalist
can
shoes
start
around the
wearing them
house?
walking. You can start wearing
Mm-hmm.
walking. But
Yep.
I want you to look up doming on YouTube because there's some good YouTube videos of doming. But doming is you're standing with your feet flat on the ground. I'm gonna do it this way, and you
Uh-huh.
press your toes down. You press your toes down. You try not to curl them, but press them. They're
Press
gonna
them
curl.
down.
And
Okay.
then you're going to pull the ball of your foot back towards your heel so that you make a dome in your foot. Just
Mm.
it's a very subtle, it
Wow.
looks like
Mm-hmm.
this. It's very subtle. And
Mm-hmm.
then hold it. It's probably going to cramp because you're probably weak. That's called dome. And
Okay.
that helps to start strengthening the muscles
Yes.
under your
And
arch.
mm-hmm.
Right. And then you can do some doming and hopping where you hold the dome and you kind of hop to try to to put a little extra load on. And then the calf raises, like those are two primary exercises, is doming and your calf raises. And that'll to help prepare you for running. And then the running, start it really slow.
Yeah. So like
Make it really, really slow and go on the ball of your foot. And just when you switch between the ball of your foot and your heel, you're going to feel the difference. The heel, it's like boom, boom. You feel this jar, whereas the ball of the foot,
I'm excited.
Sure.
All right. I'm excited because as I said to you before,
if you get back running, you have to let me know.
Okay. Because as I said to you before we started, and I actually said it in the last podcast, I've been an injured runner forever. So I cycle every day. But if I could run, I would just throw my racing bike, my fancy carbon fiber racing bike on the road and just let a truck run over it. I'd be totally happy to do that. So, but the funny thing is I've been motivated to run the last 2 podcasts in a row. So, sorry, the one before. So 2 podcasts ago, I actually had heart transplant patients. Don't even call them patients anymore. Guys that have had heart transplants and they're doing Ironman races now.
Wow.
And one of them is faster than he was before. So he was a triathlete before he had the heart transplant. And so anyway, they got me motivated. So I said, okay, I'm going to go out and run.
If a heart transplant person can do it, I can do it.
Exactly. So they got me motivated. And then afterwards I went, oh shit, because I just said on air that I'm going to run a 5K in May because that's what and it's like, but I'm going to get injured. So now I've actually can do, okay, maybe May's too early. Can I do it in May?
Maybe. Well, I think you just have to see how you do it. It may be too early, especially if you have problems with your calf. Your calf's going to take some time to get it built up.
All right. Well, that's fantastic. All right. So this is great. I mean, I had it totally back to front. So I was going to say, let's talk about this versus that and doing this. But the bottom line is, so, okay, we're going to do a summing up at the end, but you're basically saying minimalist shoes, landing on the ball of your foot and having strength. Well, I guess you don't need, once you actually get to the point where you're running, where because you've got to undo the years of lazy feet and running on weird shoes and things. Once you undo that, I guess you don't have to do strengthening or anything. You just run, right?
It's just like walking. We don't have to do strengthening exercise for walking, but it depends on how much running you want to do and whether you want to increase your running. If you do, you may want to, increase your strengthening. I mean, you want to have a strong body because, you don't want to, what happens when your muscles are weak is you end up, your mechanics end up breaking down. Right. So strength, if you strengthen the muscles, it doesn't change your mechanics. It doesn't. You have to, there's hardware and software. Hardware being your musculoskeletal system, software being the motor pattern, right? So so you need both of those in terms of
guess what? Running. We still have a problem though, because now we're going to, myself and others are still going to go run 5K, 10K marathons. We're not built for that. We're built for like sprinting and although is this correct? They say the Aborigines.
No, we did. We're not really. I don't think we're built for running marathons, 26 miles on hard surfaces for long distances. I don't think we were built for that. But we have the ability to train to do that. I mean, that's not the way we ran before. We never ran 26 miles in a straight line on hard surface, on the same surface.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? We were running out and running and, on the savannah and running after kudu and, those animals. And so it was different. It was different for sure. But there are people who can run long distances in marathons and ultra marathons if they trained for it. So you can train for it, but
yes,
I like the half. I think the half marathon is a really reasonable. People tend to get injured a lot in training for marathons. We see it a lot. A half marathon is a little bit more reasonable of a distance, although I don't ever want to take someone's goal away from them. If that's what they want to do, I say all the more power to them. But a half marathon is a reasonable distance.
I used to like the 10K. People would say, I say,
10K.
I used to be a serious.
I like the 10K too.
Yeah, I say I used to be a serious runner. Oh, if you run a marathon, I go, no. And they go, oh, okay. And it's like, hang on, but I was a serious 10K. Like, But,
no, I agree. I totally agree.
I realized I'd run a marathon in training, but not in a race. But yeah, it doesn't count. Okay, so can we go through, I think we've got I've got it in my head and hopefully everyone else does, the big issues here about running injuries. Although you say it is controversial, yeah? So some people will argue with this.
Oh, yeah. People will argue, I argue all the time with colleagues and clinicians who believe that it's fine to run on your heels, and they wouldn't change that about somebody's running. And I feel differently about it. So if you want to know where the controversies are, that's where the controversies are. Should you change someone's running pattern? That's somewhat there are people say you shouldn't.
Yeah.
And then should you, and part of it is changing their pattern in terms of putting them in, changing them to a forefoot strike pattern. Also shoes, footwear. There's really nothing wrong with cushioning and all of that. There are people who believe that. Yeah, so those are some of the controversies when you say, what are the controversies?
And in a way, they're both the same in a way, isn't it? Because you said when you have the cushioned shoes, you do land on your heel more.
Kind of all goes together. I did want to touch on we talked a little bit about if it's not broke, don't fix it. I told you that people come to me broke. There was a study recently where they took 320 runners, I think it was 320, and they divided, or 160, and there was 80 and 80, I can't remember exactly, but they divided them into two groups. It was a large number of runners, and they were all heel strikers. And in one group, they ran on a treadmill, and in one group, they gave them feedback on that vertical ground reaction force curve, and they told them to get rid of this, to get rid of the impact.
Like get rid of that initial big peak.
Get rid of that initial impact. The other group just ran on a treadmill the same number of miles in time that the other group did, but didn't get any feedback, right? They just stayed. So, of course, they remained heel strikers and having an impact. The other group were able to reduce their impact significantly, but these are all healthy people, all healthy to start out with. They then this group followed them for 1 year. And the group that changed their mechanics to landing more softly and more on the ball,
just that one time.
No, they went through an 8-session training period.
I see.
They retraining. The guy actually trained with me, so he followed our protocol. But anyways, they followed them for a year. And the group that got the retraining and that reduced their impacts had 62% fewer injuries.
Ooh.
A fourfold decrease in their knee injuries, which is the most common running injury. So there's a case where intervening sort of prophylactically before they're injured and fixing it when it's not broke really kind of paid off. Now, one study doesn't make it so. You need more studies like that. But when you have studies like that, you start to think, and again, this goes back to if we could start out this way, right? If we didn't put those kind of shoes on our kids, let our kids be barefoot, put our kids in minimal shoes and keep them in minimal shoes, then they wouldn't develop that heel strike pattern, that extended knee, those kinds of things, that maybe we wouldn't be having some of the problems. I don't think it would solve everything, but I think we wouldn't have as many problems as we have today. So I believe that it starts with kids. That's the whole grail. The holy grail is kids. And all my grandkids, I have grandkids, all my grandkids are in like minimals.
So that's pretty impressive, because that's a pretty big N. Like you said, 80 or 160, and it was reduced by 62%.
Yeah, the group that got the retraining had a 60%.
Now, with the retraining, was it just saying land on your forefoot rather than your heel, or do they put them in the minimalist shoes?
They didn't change the shoes. So they only said land, just they didn't change the footwear in this particular study. They didn't tell them how to land either. They just said get rid of this impact. And most of them did transition. That's how they did it. Yeah.
This is mixing me up a little bit, because I was thinking when you've got the fat heeled shoes, it makes you land on your heel.
So it does, but if you're trying to change the impact, you can kind of override that. But here is the problem, and this gets into a whole nother area. When you land, and I wish I could show you the videos because it becomes very clear. When you land with a forefoot strike pattern in regular shoes, you end up with more plantar flexion than you should, because this is about how much plantar flexion you have when you land barefoot or with minimal shoes. So you really plantar flex, which
more
loads
toe down.
And if you look from the front, you're more inverted. You land way over on the outside of your foot. So you have the kind of a very fast velocity pronation and greater pronation excursion. And if you watch somebody, you can see it. I see it all the time when I'm watching people who are in regular shoes running with a forefoot strike pattern. So I think, and the other thing is that anterior posterior impacts and your medial lateral impacts as a forefoot striker and regular shoes are higher. So you have greater, because you're more angled this way. So this impact is higher.
Toe, just for people not watching. So yeah, you toe down more. So your anterior, which is the front. So you toe down more.
Right. And if you're
toe to back is more.
And if you land more on the outside of your foot. So you end up with greater
pronation.
And impacts when you land in that direction.
Oh,
so
okay.
So no one's talking about this, but the medial lateral and anterior posterior ground reaction forces are also important, and we need to start paying attention to them more. So if you're gonna be a rear foot striker and you don't want to change your strike pattern, you should put cushioning under your heel, because otherwise it's going to hurt. That's why, that's that cushioning. I would suggest that you try to get shoes that don't have much flare, so you don't have excessive torques on the foot and the knee. And try to go with less of a heel to toe drop. If you really are sold on staying as a heel striker, I never try to change someone if they don't want to. If you are going to go to a forefoot strike, don't do it in regular shoes. You really need to go in minimal shoes. And it's easier to do the forefoot strike in a minimal shoe. It's much more natural.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about because we're going to have a couple of colleagues on that have agreed to come on. And, the controversy side, wouldn't they say, well, hang on a minute, you're saying you need to change the shoes to minimalist, and that helps you to land on your forefoot. But you just said study, they kept their same shoes and they landed on their forefoot and they reduced their injuries by 62%.
So, but would those injuries have been reduced even more is my question. So there's certain injuries that would be reduced by lowering the vertical impact. We know that vertical impact loads are related to certain injuries, but I would, if they had looked, and I don't think they did, at the anterior, posterior, medial lateral forces of the people who became forefoot strikers, I think those would be higher. And we don't know what those injuries are related to, those particular.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And the other controversy.
I know what you're saying. I can see the argument for sure. The highest impacts overall, the highest resultant impacts in both anterior, posterior, medial lateral, and vertical, the highest overall impacts are when you're forefoot striking in a pair of regular shoes. Those are the highest impacts. So, I think that the fact that they reduced their vertical is what probably contributed to the reduction in the injuries over the year, the 62% reduction. But they increased their anterior, posterior, and medial lateral. And so what kind of injuries, because we know I can hypothesize the injuries that are probably related. It hasn't been studied yet. But if you're landing on the lateral side of your foot, we're talking about lateral kinds of injuries like fifth metatarsal stress fractures, loading of the perineals, which are on the outside of the foot. And if you have an increase in pronation after your landing, then that's going to be your posterior tib, having to load that. So there definitely are injuries that I think need to be studied that are related to the other components. It's just that we all started with the vertical.
Okay.
But I understand your argument.
Complicated now.
It's a little complicated. I started out talking only about the vertical ground reaction force and the impact, which I think is really important. Don't get me wrong.
And that's the one you get. So when you land on your heel, you're getting that vertical force immediately, and then you get another force. And you're saying you don't get that if you land on the forefoot.
You don't get the first force. You don't get
that first one. Yeah, exactly.
The first one you don't get. Right.
Exactly.
It's so much easier to talk about this when you've got slides that you can kind of demonstrate.
Yeah, I know. And people really should get on YouTube if they're trying to.
Yeah, so talk about biomechanics, you talk about moment arms and things. It's hard to do it when you don't have that visual.
So if people are struggling with, because you're showing, if people are on Apple Podcasts, for example, and they're just hearing it, they're not seeing it, go onto YouTube and you can see, because you're doing a lot of showing your hand doing this.
Yeah, I'm trying to show it with my hand. So
which does help.
Yeah.
All right, great. So, all right. So if I could just look through my notes here, what causes running injury? Okay. Can you just say with running injuries, is it generally you have like a microtear first and then it gets worse? Or do you know actually what happens with an injury generally? Like, obviously it can come on straight away, but I'm assuming there's like a microtear first with these chronic.
It depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about bone, there can be micro damage in the bone that ends up becoming more and more
Stress fracture.
yeah, right, from a stress fracture. Stress fracture can actually can advance all the way to an acute fracture.
Okay. Okay. I
Like
guess I was
just
thinking more about muscle. Sorry, but
so in terms of muscle, yes. So you get an you get an inflammation, and then you can get microtears in it, and then those microtears can get larger, and once the muscle gets really weakened, or the tendon, it can actually have a tear of the actual tendon.
So you may not necessarily, because you go for a run and it's like, oh, my calf just went, and you think it's just happened then, but it was probably a microtear already from
Right.
previous.
And sometimes when people's calves go, they'll feel a pop, and it'll be a tear in the muscle, and then they can actually see a little divot. And I've seen this before, where they have a little divot in the muscle itself. So yes, you can get microtears, and then those microtears that you don't see, if you get enough muscle that's involved, then you can get a tear of the muscle, and then you can see it. If that tear in the muscle becomes so severe, you probably wouldn't be able to run.
No. Well, I
Right.
remember a few days later, I've had like black, you could see it's bled.
Yes. So you'll see bruising in the calf, for example. Yeah.
Now, what about things like warm up, warm down? Do they reduce the chance of injuries or not?
I think it's important to warm up, and I think it's important to do a dynamic warm up, because what happens is it gets the joints lubricated, it gets the muscles elongated. The reason why people question about doing a lot of stretching before is because for running, you're not in real extreme ranges of motion, right?
Exactly.
It's not like you're kind of within limited ranges of motion when you're running, even at your hips and knees. The thing that I think is helpful in increasing the degrees of freedom that you have is if you happen to hit something and you land and you're not, and you go through an abnormal range of motion, it's nice to have that sort of flexibility and that give in the system. But in general, just warming up, getting the joints lubricated. When you run, you are constantly shortening, you're constantly shortening your muscles, right? And so getting them stretched out again sometimes is a good thing to do. So, your hamstrings are definitely getting shortened. They do get elongated. That's why I hesitated. I mean, there's a shortening in the elongation, but you want to just make sure that you've got that full range of motion after you get done. So it just feels good too to stretch afterwards.
Exactly. That's the thing.
It really does.
I remember that.
But the problem that we have is that there aren't good studies, and I'm sure other people have said this, that show that when you stretch, you have less injuries.
Exactly.
Right? That's and so, I don't think there's the science behind it is there yet, but it just makes sense that you want to make sure that you have all the degrees of freedom of motion that you need to be able to move, and that afterwards, because things get stiffened up, and especially if you start to get really tired and you stiffen your joints, because you have a tendency to do that. That's why after a marathon, people can't go downstairs because their quads are so stiff, right? Because they've had to, they're activating the quads so much that they're really stiff. And so you want to try to stretch those out and kind of massage them, that kind of thing.
Yes, if people want to hear more of this, Christian Thorborg had on talking about this, the evidence for and against ice and stretching and warm up and warm down. And so people could.
And that's the other thing, ice and heat, like, which is better, right? But because the thing is, if you have an injury, if you put ice on it, you end up with vasoconstriction, so you don't get a lot of swelling in the area, but you also don't get the new nutrients to the area. So
exactly.
I mean, people normally say that, in an acute injury, you'll give ice because you want to try to prevent the swelling. Swelling causes a lot of pain. But then once you're starting to heal, you might want to put heat on it, which makes it more compliant, doesn't get it stiff, brings in new nutrients.
Now, with stretching, because I know we talked about this with Christian Thorborg, is in the Australian Ballet actually stopped doing static stretching. They found that they thought it was doing little microtears and increasing injuries and things, and they tend to do more sort of plyometric
more dynamic,
things.
A little bit more dynamic, yeah.
More dynamic. It's more like what they're going to do in the event and things like that. So,
exactly.
But again, do you know, is there much evidence for injury prevention and coming back from injury and all that stuff by doing stretching, whether it's static, dynamic, is there much?
No, and if you hear someone else that knows, let me know, because I don't think there's really good science behind it.
It's funny because I remember we had a great runner, Robert De Castella, years and years ago, and he had a book saying, stretching and I won't go into it too much, but basically I saw him one day and he just finished his run and just got in the car and drove off. And I was like, what about stretching? And then at one stage, I know he said he could get nowhere near touching his toes, you know. And it's like, well, I don't need to, you know.
Yeah.
It's kind of like what you said before. You're not doing that range, but as you said, also, it feels good. I remember I used to do 2-hour runs, and when I finished, you'd stretch your quads, and say, oh, that feels good, because as you say, when you're contracting, well, obviously there's eccentric and concentric going on,
There's
but
both.
it's
That's
mainly
right.
shortening, isn't it? It's mainly shortening.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense to sort of just stretch it out a bit, but not like hold it for 10 seconds and then do it again, you know, all this stuff. Like this sort of scientific, so-called scientific thing, like, oh, warm up and then do all these stretches and hold and then release and hold. There isn't really much evidence as far as
I mean,
you know.
stretching just feels good, and it might feel good because it frees up the degrees, even if you're not going to run. I mean, I like to stretch. It feels good.
Mhm.
You know, maybe even just for that reason, you just feel like you've got more degrees of freedom to move,
Right.
even if you don't,
Sorry.
even if you don't need them all
Exactly.
the
Now,
degrees
I wonder
move out
while
of.
I've got you, if I could ask you about some other things quickly about injuries. So what about body weight? So I'm assuming it makes sense if you're running and you weigh, you know, 10 pounds, 10 kilos or whatever, more than used to, you're going to have greater forces, right? More likely to get injured. That's just common
Yeah.
sense, but has that been studied, I guess?
Well, like, has it been studied that body weight is related to injuries? I mean, I've seen some people run that have really, that are not the typical runner type physique, and they do just fine. It's interesting. I had, certainly in terms of impacts, and this is surprising, but one of my runners with the highest impacts using an accelerometer was someone that was very thin. Because it's not necessarily her weight, but how she lands. Like, she was landing, really pounding the ground into submission. And if you had somebody who was really heavy, but they'd learned to run really lightly, maybe they wouldn't be as injured as someone who's light that was landing, just pounding the ground into submission. So I don't know that there's a direct correlation between it. But obviously, there's lots of reasons why you want to try to
You go faster if you're lighter.
heavy. You will be fit. You'll be faster. You're probably
Up
more
hills.
efficient. You're able to move your limbs easier.
Exactly.
The moment of inertia, that means the ability to move your limbs around your joints is going to be lower. It's just, I mean, for lots of reasons in terms of a runner. And, you know, the best runners, when you look at them, they are small and thin.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Now, do you think, can anyone run? So, you know, if you build up slowly and everything, because we're built to run, right? Born to run.
We're born to run. We are born to run. Every one of us. Every one of us. And people say, well, you know, people have different body types. Well, I think we have different body types because we've become so obese. But, you know, when you look back, if you look at hunter-gatherers, they have very similar body types. I mean, I'm sure there's variability between them in their body types for sure. But you don't see the wide range of like, you know, yeah, you just don't see it. They had a really, there's a really interesting paper. I think the guy was Ponzer. I think it was Ponzer who was the first author.
Herman Ponzer.
Yeah, Herman Ponzer. And
He's
he
been
did
on
it.
the podcast.
Oh, he's great. Yeah, I saw him on the list. I know he was really good. He did a paper reviewing hunter-gatherer life. And it's based on 250 hunter-gatherer communities, some of which are still in existence today, some that are not. And he talks about how, and this is again, the fact that they're living the lives their bodies were designed for. We're not, but they are hunter-gatherers. And just no cardiovascular disease, very little cardiovascular disease, very little obesity. They're as active in a day as we are in a week, you know, and so it's just, and then the other thing that I thought was really fascinating is he talks about the health span of hunter-gatherers. So not the lifespan, health span.
Yeah.
So we expect that when people reach a certain age, it's like, okay, activity goes down, health goes down, bam, you're just heading for the grave, right? Not them. They actually stay healthy, and then they die. They either die young because of some kind of communicable disease that they don't have the antibiotics or whatever for. They can't, but those who actually get past that and live, they live the same length of lives that we do. And I didn't realize that. That was really
Ah,
fascinating.
mhm.
So their health spans are longer.
Mhm.
So this is what we need to do is we need to aim for longer health spans.
Exactly. Perfect. All right. So talking about different body types and things, what about Q angle? So I remember learning this in my undergrad. So, you know, you say, oh, she's got childbearing hips and like
Yeah.
wide hips, and then you have that angle coming in is the Q angle, I think, say from the hips to the knee. You kind of touched on that earlier. Do people with that with that sort of angle have more injuries generally? Do you
So
know?
there have been studies looking at anterior knee pain because it's mostly related to anterior knee pain because it's the line between the front hip bone, your ASIS, down to the mid patella
Which is your
and
kneecap. Yep.
kneecap, and then down to your tibial tubercle, the bone right underneath your kneecap on your tibia. There's a little
Yes.
protuberance. That's the Q angle, right? And the greater that angle, the more tendency your patella has to laterally maltrack.
Yes, to the outside. Yes.
To the outside. And that's probably the more common maltracking pattern that we see because we're set up with a Q angle. And the way the body deals with that is that so that it doesn't laterally maltrack as much, our lateral femoral condyle is higher. It keeps it as a buttress so that the patella doesn't move so far laterally. Does it make sense?
Okay. So just maybe explain to people. So you're talking about the bit that sticks out on the outside of your knee above
Yeah,
the
if
kneecap.
you're looking along, if you're looking at the bone from the end of the bone straight,
Mhm.
so the bone is like the straight ahead of you, and you're looking at the end of it, you'll see a bump on the lateral side of the femur and the medial side, and then
It's the
patella is
outside and
on
the inside.
top.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so you have a higher lateral side to that femoral condyle, that side of the femur, and it keeps the patella in. It
Yes.
prevents it from laterally maltracking because the way that we're set up has a tendency to laterally maltrack
Okay.
because of the angle, because of the
Because
Q
the
angle.
angle.
Now, the
And
studies that have been done between Q angle and patellofemoral pain have shown nothing. But
no.
I believe it's because you can have a little bit of an increased Q angle and not have a problem at all. But I think that once you get past a certain point, it becomes problematic. It's just like how much of a leg length discrepancy is problematic. You know,
Mm-hmm.
is it 1 centimeter leg length discrepancy? Maybe not. People can adapt to that. They
It's
can
very
adjust.
common, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
But if you have a 3 centimeter or a 4 centimeter leg length
Yeah.
discrepancy, now you get a problem. I think it's the same with any kind of alignment issue. If you're just a little bit increased or even moderately increased, maybe
Yeah.
you can adapt to
Can
it.
adapt
But
to
I
it.
do think it becomes important when it becomes extreme.
Mm-hmm. And I know there's because it's my name's McConnell with one end, which is very strange. But
Any?
most McConnells are two ends. So there's Jenny McConnell, the McConnell
Yeah.
technique, where you tape to try and affect the tracking. Do you know? Is there evidence for that? Do you know if you?
Well, if you talk to Jenny, she
Yeah.
definitely there is. I think what it does, and she'll say this herself, is the idea is to bring the patella back into more normal alignment so that the person can exercise with it in good alignment and try to train those muscles to keep it in good alignment, as opposed to when if you don't tape it and you try and do the exercise and it's bad alignment, causes more pain. So by taping it, it's not that the tape is going to make a permanent change, but it's a reminder. It's not even a reminder. It actually mechanically can move the patella in and then put it in a better alignment so that people can exercise more effectively.
Mm-hmm. All right. I got some quick questions from Twitter. So Robbie asked running volume and injuries. So the classic thing about, I guess you'd say don't increase by more than, they used to say 10%, but now quite often people say 5%. Do you ever feel, again, it's not it's not hard and
Yeah,
fast.
it's not, I don't think
Uh,
it's hard and fast. I think it depends on the person. So we're all different. And I think you've got to figure out for yourself and your body what you can tolerate in terms of increases. Depends on, your current, how recently you were injured and your injury status and all of that. But I did see a study that it was in JOSPT, I think in 2014, Journal of Orthopedic and Sports PT, that suggested that those that increased more than 20% per week were those that got injured. So,
Not
I've seen
surprisingly.
20%, 10%, and then it also depends on how much you're
How much
running.
you're doing, exactly.
Yeah, because
10% of what?
10%, right, 10% of 1 mile is a tenth of a mile, 10% of, So,
100
so
miles.
I,
Yeah.
I think you have to be reasonable
Yeah.
in your increase, and you have to, I can't say this enough. You have to listen to your body. Pain is a gift. Pain is a gift that says, this is too much for this tissue at this moment. I'm not a fan of running through pain. Other people will say, yeah, if it's only, 3 out of 10, or if it goes away afterwards. The reason I'm not a fan of running through pain is because you will make these changes in your gait that you don't even know. It's imperceptible, and you'll do it automatically. And you might end up loading another joint on the same side or loading the other leg abnormally. Pain is your body's way of saying this is too much for this tissue at this moment. So runners don't listen to their bodies. And that's a really good guideline when you talk about volume and things like that. It's, in terms of what's too much. That's, I think, really one of the things that you need to pay attention to when it comes to injury.
Right. Now, I've managed to bring up my own running a lot, but what about you? You were a barefoot runner and then you had problem. Did you want to
Yeah,
just...
Yeah, I was a runner, and then I actually came across Chris McDougall. He came down to interview me, and when I was at the University of Delaware, and he said, you got to try. I said, should I try this, barefoot running? I said, should I try these minimal shoes? And he said, no, you should go barefoot because you get the most sensory input when you run barefoot. And I said, well, I'm a girl. I like to paint my toes and I don't want calluses on my feet. And he said, you know what, honey, the world is your pumice stone. You run on bare feet, it'll keep your feet nice and soft. And I don't know if that's true or not, but so he really got me. He's the one that got me running in minimal shoes. And what I did is I started out just running a quarter of a mile, and then I'd run a half a mile.
Sorry, what were you doing before that? Just out of interest. What were you...
maybe like not a lot. Like I was a 10K kind of. I ran 10. I would run 10K. I was running maybe up to 20 miles a week. So I was doing other things. I've never been like just running,
which is probably
what
smart.
I'm saying? Yeah, maybe. And so I started, and every time I increased, because I didn't know enough about strengthening my feet at the time. So I just would increase a little bit. And every time I feel my calf not go, but I felt my calf get sore. It was mostly my soleus. For me, it was soleus. It wasn't my gastroc. It's the one that's down lower near your ankle, right? And then I'd slowly, increase, and I'd feel it every single time. Now if I were to do that again, I always tell people strengthen your calves first, do the foot doming and all those kinds of things. And then I was in Boston. And so, as I said, there were some really fun surfaces to run barefoot on, like the bricks and Back Bay and Beacon Hill and things like that. But I also ran with minimal shoes. I think I've mentioned this to you before, I have dysplasia, which is a shallow hip socket. And when you have a shallow hip socket, the labrum, that's a word for lip basically, but the labrum grows long to try to hold the head into the joint, and it's long and thin and it tears. And so I had, over the years have developed these tears in my labrum. And and when that happens, you lose the stability of the joint, and you end up getting some breakdown of the joint. And I ended up having a total hip on one side, went back to running. Then I ended up with it. So it wasn't the running. It's just, they told me this was bound to happen. I ended up with another total hip because I actually walked on that painful hip for a year because I didn't want to give up my anatomy. So the minute it started happening, the second hip, I just went ahead because I didn't want to give up any more activity. I wanted to be able to be active. So after the second one, I just decided, and I was really thinking about I want to do more multi-directional activities. So started getting into some other activities other than something that's so straightforward. So that's sort of my history. So
two total hip replacements.
Total hips, but you know what? They're great. I don't have a single problem with them. I can do a full squat. I squat every single day, not with weights, but I squat. I make sure I can squat. All my patients have to squat a full squat, if they can. Some people have lost the range of motion in their ankles to be able to do a full squat, but I try to get them close to as full squat as possible because again, it's what we were designed to
It's
do.
how we used to sit. Yeah, and if you go to like I've traveled in Vietnam and Cambodia and all that stuff, you see the 70, 80-year-old woman just squatting. That's how they
Exactly. And if you watch kids, they squat for, half hour. They sit down, play on the ground, they're
exactly, and
squatting.
they lose it exactly.
But we lose that. We lose the ability to do that. So yeah.
So just to make it clear, because some people might say, oh, well, you had these, even though you explained it, they might say, well, you had your hip replacements because you were running barefoot, and if you had the cushioning of the shoe and whatever. Are you saying if you were never a runner, you would have had, even if you weren't a runner at all, you would have had this problem?
Yes, I would have had this problem. I was told I would have had those problems. Yeah.
Right.
I just
Well,
never really realized that I had that. And I had some hip related pain even early in my 20s. And I kind of ignored it. I did a lot of dance and a lot of turnout in dance, which really puts a big load, like beyond what you're supposed to have. That's what dancers do, right? And I didn't do a lot of ballet, but even in jazz, you had to really do a lot of turnout. And so I probably was cranking my hips back then too. So I attribute more of my hip problems to the dance than I do to the running.
all right. So someone's going to be saying, oh, well, you should have just sat on the couch then
Yeah,
and
exactly.
not done all that.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So Paul on Twitter has said, and I think we know the answer to this, but I just want to read it out. I'd be interested in her take on the super trainers, 50 millimeters, that's 2-inch stack height, multiple carbon fiber plates. Have they gone too far or not far enough? I think we know what you're going to say there, but
Yeah. Um, I think they've gone too far myself. And if you've listened to this podcast so far, you'll know that I believe that we should be allowing our feet that we have amazing feet, 26 bones, 33 articulations, each with 6 degrees of freedom of motion, 10 muscles and 4 layers in our arch. Our feet are designed amazingly. And so I want shoes that allow our feet to do what they're supposed to do. And the minute you start adding things, you take away from what the body's going to do. So I'm just not a fan of adding all that cushioning and then the rigidity of the plate. We've had, as I mentioned earlier, there's one paper that came out, the navicular stress fractures may be related to that. We still don't know. We still don't know. But I don't think we're ever going to pull it back. I think that the shoe companies really want to be able to be innovative. They want to be able to make things, of course, and every runner wants to be faster. And so if there's a shoe that shows that they can be faster or do it with less energy, then they're going to go for it.
maybe the best pullback we could hope for is, well, I mean, obviously I've become a convert because I'm just saying we can hope for is if they train on minimalist shoes and then race on these things, because I know that
problematic. I think that's problematic.
Exactly.
But I think here's a compromise. If people don't want to give up their cushioned shoes, then just walk around in minimal shoes. At least the majority of the time you'll be strengthening your feet. I mean, that we know that based on the studies that every single study that's been shown, walking and running increases the strength of the foot. So at a minimum, if you don't want to give up your shoes for running, walk in minimal shoes. And what's funny is that once people get into minimal shoes, they never want to go back. The cushioning it just feels weird and unnatural to them. And I had that same experience.
Okay, now Jacob's asked one where I think we can also guess the answer from this. Do we have any evidence for shoes that claim to correct for pronation on injury prevention, or is neutral best? So I guess we could guess what you're going to say here as well.
I don't think there's a lot of evidence. And in fact, when you look at the rate of injuries based on the PubMed and the publication, that's the number of studies on running injuries have not gone down despite all of the technology and money that's gone into footwear when you think about it. There was a really interesting study by Joe Napick. He was in the military. He did a study that was he did one in the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, and they put them all together in a large meta-analysis. And what he did is he took one half of the recruits and he put them into a shoe based on their foot type. So if they had a flat pronated foot, they got an anti-pronation shoe, motion control shoe. If they had a high arch, they got a cushioning shoe. And if they had a normal neutral arch, they got a neutral shoe. The other group all got a neutral shoe. And then they followed them for injuries. And in every study, whether they're individual Army, Navy, Marines, or when they put them together in meta-analysis, no difference in injury patterns. So all of that prescribing footwear based on foot type and what they still do in the running shoe stores is not based on any evidence at all.
All right. Now, I actually saw a comment on Twitter. It said, Irene Davis is revolutionizing running injury rehab with her gait retraining. Is that?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Is that fair to say? Yeah.
I don't know. I think I pioneer. I'm one of the pioneers in gait retraining for runners for sure. And like I said, when I first started out, people really thought it was crazy. And I'm glad to see, because there've been a number of studies where people actually are doing some retraining when it makes sense. When you see a reason to do it, you see the abnormal mechanic, you know it's related to injury, you want to change it, right? Then it makes sense to do it. And people are now doing it. I'm seeing studies coming out. So I just like the idea. I mean, we change other movement patterns. If you go to a PT and you're lifting and you're not bending your knees, that PT is going to teach you to move different. What is so different about running? You know, we physical therapists are trained movement scientists in a sense. And so it's no different for walking or running.
I guess the reason it gets confused, because as you could probably tell, when I first started, this chat, I thought, well, don't change because it's natural. But I guess we're not natural, because if we'd kept running barefoot feet like when we were kids, and we'd kept squatting, so make sure people know what we're talking about. Just talking about sitting right down with your butt on the back of your heels.
Right.
If we kept doing that, then we probably wouldn't run the way we are, so uncoordinated.
And if we were running in minimal shoes or running barefoot, we wouldn't be running and moving in the way that we are. But there's always going to be abnormalities, right? So, you don't change it unless there's an abnormality causing a problem, at least for now, except for that one study that I talked about, that prophylactic study. But that's why you would change it. It's their pattern, whatever it is, you can say it's their natural pattern, but if their natural pattern is causing them to have pain and injury because it's overloading a certain structure, it's like if someone walks like this all the time and they end up with a back problem, you're going to try to get them to walk more upright.
Correct.
It's just correcting. The more well-aligned you are, nobody's going to be perfectly aligned. I realize that, but the more well-aligned you are, the less the risk for injury.
Okay. Now, sex differences. Are there sex differences in injury rates, running injury rates?
There absolutely are. So females have higher rates of bone stress injuries. Females have higher rates of patellofemoral pain. And I think that has to do with their alignment.
Oh, the Q.
Men have higher rates of tendinopathies, particularly like Achilles tendinopathy. Men have greater rates in patella.
Do we know why that is, these differences?
I think it might have to do with the stiffness of the tendons, perhaps, or maybe just their structure. I know with the patellofemoral pain, it's more alignment. And bone, it can be related to hormonal effects on bone.
Of course.
For women. So yeah, there are differences.
All right. Now, age. Now, we always say, and I've made it clear, I think as I get older, I get more calf injuries and whatever. That's sort of the idea, right? That you'll see football players, Australian rules football and American football, as they get older, they tend to do their hamstring more. They tend to do their calf. Is there actually evidence for that, or does it just feel like that? Do you know?
I think there are certain ages where injuries, certain injuries become more prevalent, right? And sort of over 45 seems to be when men tend to tear their Achilles, something like that. I think I'm not sure if that's the exact age. And again, it might be just that the tissues are becoming less compliant. With women, it could be the bones are becoming more osteoporotic as they go through menopause. So there's those kind of age-related things. We know that you start to lose your distal power as you age faster than your proximal power. And what I mean by that is you start to lose your power of your feet and your ankles before, say, your hips and your shoulders. So you might be more prone as you age to those kind of injuries if you're not paying attention to it. That's why we really think it's important to pay attention to feet, because that. So I think that different injuries are affected differently by age.
All right, great. I think, do you think we've covered everything?
We covered a lot.
We've
I
covered
just
a
looked at
lot.
the time. I can't
I
believe it's
know.
7 o'clock. We
Well,
did it.
time flies when you're having fun.
It
I
does,
did.
yeah.
I did want to finish up just the fact that you're president of ACSM. I think that sounds amazing. So well done with that to actually
Thank
be
you.
to get
Thank
that.
you.
Did you want to tell us what does that involve? I imagine you must just be very busy.
It's first of all, being elected is very humbling. It's really a privilege. It's the largest sports medicine organization in the world. It's so I love it. And what I love about ACSM, remember started out talking about how I have one foot in medicine and one in science. That's the space I live in. Well, that's ACSM.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly.
Science and medicine. So I love
Yes.
it. I mean, I love my other professions, APTA and ASB, biomechanics, but this is the thing about ACSM that really draws me to it. And but its biggest strength, its greatest strength, because it's got a lot of diversity, the people in nutrition and all kinds of areas. And we've got physicians and basic scientists. And so the biggest strength is also its greatest challenge, because you've got those different groups sort of vying for resources and wanting to, have their areas being, addressed. And so that's the challenge of it. It's been a great lesson in leadership for me. It's been a really important growing experience for me. You start out as president-elect, which gives you a chance to kind of sit back, and you're also very active. There's a president-elect, president, and past president year. So it's really 3 years, and each one has different responsibilities. So like as president-elect, you're in charge of the annual program, and but you have a chance to kind of grow into it. You have a chance to lead. And then you sort of, as you're moving out of the past president, you can help to mentor the people coming on board. So it's been a great experience, but thank you for asking.
I mean, well done getting that gig. I remember I did my master's at Ball State with David Costa. We talked about him before he came on. And I know you said you watched that one, which is great.
Yeah, I did. I did.
But when I used to go to that, ACSM, there might have been, I don't know, 400 abstracts or something. And then it became like 1,000. And you'd literally go to ACSM, there'd be 13 or something things on at once. I haven't been for a while because I became more diabetes and exercise metabolism and all that. Is there still there must be like 2,000
We've cut it down
abstracts.
to 10. We have 10 consecutive sessions at the same time now, and it's less. But it's still, and we obviously with COVID, we didn't have a meeting for a year, and then we're kind of building back up again. But people are coming back again to the meetings. We're wondering if people are going to change. They want from remote, but people, I mean, I'm the same way. I think being in person. I mean, I'd much rather be doing this interview if I was sitting across the table from you.
True.
I mean, it's fine to do it, at least see faces, but so people really want to come back together again. So it's growing. I think we had 4,000 last year. We're hoping to get 5,000 or close to 5,000 this year.
Wow. Yeah, well, it's definitely better in person because I remember, when I was first year on my master's, I was running around. I was trying to go, 13 things on at once, racing around. And then I realized the second time I just stood in the corridor half the time and just talked to people because it's the networking and it's meeting people.
That's almost the best part of it, really, is the networking and getting to see people. Yeah. It's
All
in
right.
Boston this year for anyone that's listening.
Oh, cool. Great. Okay. Now, I'd like to finish up with just some takeaway messages from the chat. So what are your sort of takeaways?
Takeaway message from everything that we talked about. I think one of the takeaway messages is the closer we are to the way that we adapted to move, the less the risk for injury. And so we need to embrace our evolutionary legacy. And that doesn't mean we're going to go back and move into caves or to do away with cars or airplanes, but we need to think about moving in many directions and trying to embrace the body that we have and use it in multiple ways. So multi-directional movements, those kinds of things. That's my biggest takeaway. And that encompasses everything, because it means the foot moves the way it's supposed to. We run the way we're supposed to. We walk the way we're supposed to. We don't sit all the time. I just ordered a bike desk for myself, so I can bike while I'm working. So we have to do things like that to try to replace the fact that we don't have that in our lives anymore. I'm not saying we're going to go back to being hunter and gatherers, but we need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing is it too late to change? So people might be thinking, I'm 50, 60, 70. I've been sitting my whole life, not exercising, running with fat shoes on, whatever. It's not too late to
I think
change.
the older you are, I think the longer it takes, the more time you need to be able to make those changes. So you have to be cognizant of age in that regard, but I think you can change at any point.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Just be reasonable.
Be reasonable. Thank you very much for coming on. Sorry, what's that?
I said, be reasonable.
Be reasonable. Thank you very much for coming on. I've learned a stack, and I'm all fired up. So I was fired up a few weeks ago, and I'm fired up again. So I'm going to get back into running thanks to this.
And let me know. I want to know how it goes.
Okay. Thank you. See you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please like, subscribe, pass it on to your friends and colleagues. Check out the other podcasts. Thanks again.